Welcome to the LPP podcast. This is a segment of the LPP podcast called Sundays with Stories. I'm Zach Rhodes, and today I spoke with a man named Jason Terrell, who after a years-long addiction to drugs, jail time, and a felony that still weighs him down, managed to overcome addiction on his own without support groups, rehabs, or any additional addiction treatment. Actually, he was involved in addiction treatment for a while, which he says wound up only bogging him down. Such naturally occurring addiction recovery actually forms the basis for our Sundays with Stories series. The Life Process Program is a program that uses cognitive behavioral techniques to help people help themselves, as opposed to more traditional and mainstream treatment approaches which brand you with an addiction identity and tell you that they're uniform ways of living which you must adhere to, or else you'll remain addicted forever. The stories we tell on Sundays with Stories oppose this ideological framework completely, and it's my pleasure to share Jason's natural recovery story with you today. Note that Jason is becoming increasingly involved in the harm reduction community. You can check out and join his Facebook group, Rethink Addiction, but he would like to do even more to educate the public where he can. He has felonies on his criminal record, which really hurt his chances at pursuing various careers, which he'd be great at. And he's passionate about addiction and harm reduction. So if you're a like-minded individual and you know about opportunities that align with Jason's interests, then make sure you reach out and let him know, or reach out to me and I'll reach out to him. The guy's a wealth of knowledge, and he loves learning. In any case, please enjoy today's not-so-recovery story with a man who achieved life balance through mindfulness and common sense. This is my friend and yours, Jason Terrell. I'm here with Jason Terrell. Jason, thank you so much for being with me.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Zach. Thanks for having me.
Well, I got to say, you were the first, actually, I just interviewed a colleague of mine who works in the Life Process Program, and he is, out of this series that we're doing, the first person to actually tell his own story. And in some ways, it's in such a great story, and then in some ways, it's like, well, he works with you. Maybe you're staging the story. So Stanton and I have been telling stories of celebrities for the past 7 weeks or so on a YouTube channel as a way of saying, you know, because everyone kind of can track these celebrity stories. We all can read the cliff notes and know what happened in their advancement. And we can see how just normal life changes occurred. So whatever happened with their drug use or destructive alcohol use or whatever it was, or sex, they managed to mature out of it by just finding connection with people, you know, good, meaningful work and purpose in life. And people started writing in saying, it's great that you can use these stories, but they're all hypothetical. You know, they're all not hypothetical, abstract, because you don't have the person on. So I will have to tell you that you were the first person outside of our network that I'm lucky enough to talk to about your own story. I wonder if you could tell people just a little bit about who you are and where you're from and what it means that you've had an addiction in the past, if that's even something that you'd say.
Well, my name is Jason. I'm a single dad. I'm from Virginia originally, a really small town. I moved to Florida when I was 14. I think a huge part of my story to point out is that when I was in middle school, I dealt with a lot of struggles with my peer group, bullying specifically, which I really think in my situation really set me up for some difficulties. So I had those experiences in middle school. You know, at the time I'm living in a small town. And then at 14, which is obviously, you know, I mean, that's a big time, just starting puberty and all that. And then I'm moving to a completely different place, a bigger city. And I think within a couple years, you know, I'm experimenting with things and I really approached it with an intensity, like a very serious intensity, because, you know, there's two things going on. I really didn't feel great about myself. I didn't stand for a lot of things. Like I didn't have a lot of goals. Like it was just kind of like whatever. And, you know, I think I mentioned I was curious. So I just really took it and ran with it. You know, I started, you know, drinking, I started smoking weed. And I fell into a crowd that was very open-minded to various experiences. And I think early on it was somewhat innocent, but again, like I was really approaching it in a big way. And then of course, the thing about addiction is it just evolved and it became in a way a deep part of who I was. Like I thought of myself as a drug user, and So it was a worldview and a behavior, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So you like took on the identity as someone who uses drugs.
Yes, I did. And I really kind of defended it. And it was just like, this is what I want to do. And so at the time, I didn't really see it as a problem. It was just, it was me against the world kind of things. And it was the way I responded to life. I mean, I would look at people that would cope, quote unquote, normally with emotion as like weird. Like, why are they doing that? Why don't they smoke weed? Why don't they drink? It just doesn't,
What's an example of that? Like you saw someone coping, without drugs. What kinds of things were you looking at and saying, I wonder why they do that?
I would say, my family, it's just, if something bad happens, and they're just kind of walking through it and coping with it and whatever way they do, I just saw that as a way to medicate and just kind of walk through it. And that just became the way I dealt with things for a long time. And not only that, I was a very anxious person. I was very quiet. And I think deep inside, I always wanted to be the extrovert. I thought the extrovert was the person that got everything, so to speak. So yeah, it just became a lifestyle. And I started to get into trouble. I started to hurt the people that I care about. I started to steal, and I started to do harder drugs, of course. And then the physical dependency factor came in, whether I was doing alcohol or opiates. And in my early 20s was my first introduction into recovery or 12-step. And that's when I learned what my problem was, for the first time, which is that I have a disease. I have an illness that's going to last forever. I learned the tenets of what it means to be a recovering addict or a recovering alcoholic. And then I'm powerless, what you're taught there. And what's really interesting is I went to the first rehab that I went to. It was 15 months. And I went there because I had got into trouble. And my counselor, she was in the program. She didn't, I mean, meeting with her was more like talk therapy than just kind of having a conversation than what I now know to be like cognitive behavior therapy or something like that. And this is, I'm 20 years old. I didn't learn what a cognitive distortion was until I was 30, which is really interesting because CBT is really important for treating anxiety and depression and things like that. So
yeah, sure.
So it's like I went through 2 or 3 rehabs and never learned those things. There was such a focus on the 12-step model as being kind of the way to get out of this. So I just kept kind of beating my head against the wall. Like I never really dealt with, I was diagnosed with social anxiety and I never really addressed that. Like I kept going to meetings thinking that was the solution to that. Like, and I never shared. Like it was really hard to be there. Like it was kind of the opposite of what I needed to be doing to really get better. So yeah, in and out. And then eventually I'm like, a lot of things happened. Number one, I was fired by a sponsor for not sharing in meetings. Like I told the guy, I said, hey, I have this issue. I do not like sharing in meetings. I'll do whatever else you tell me. I just don't want to go to meetings. And I also told him that I'm going to take something for the anxiety. And he didn't like those two things. He said, no, if you're not willing to do what I tell you, and then I'm going to fire you. And I felt really defeated by that. The next thing is my girlfriend at the time she was in Pennsylvania. She passed away from a heroin overdose, which was huge.
Yeah. Sorry to hear that.
Yeah. So finally I started Googling around, and at the time questioning to me, like I didn't see the need to question. I felt it was my problem. Like I was doing something wrong. Like I wasn't doing the 4-step right, or I wasn't going to enough meetings. There was always some reason why things weren't going right. So that's what I stumbled upon Dr. Stan Peel's work. I started to read Dr. Mark Lewis. I started to find all these different ways of thinking about addiction. And I mean, I was so happy to find this, but at the same time, like really angry because, here I am, been labeling myself this way for so long. And there's like this huge shift. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's me. I just need to figure this out. I've kind of been going on a rant here. I'm going to pause. Is there anything you wanted to ask?
That was very well said and so interesting. So yeah, do you feel like, even though this term is being overused so much recently, do you feel a sense that that gaslighting was happening? Like everything is supposedly your fault. And so you felt like you couldn't question anything, like you didn't have the basis to question anything. And then you found the work of people who sort of illustrated your own thoughts in words that were sensible. And these are like smart people talking about how, addiction's not a disease. Maybe you won't have it forever. There are other ways to cope with it. Do you feel like like you mentioned, you're angry. So I'm just curious. Do you feel like, were you angry because you feel like you'd been lied to, or you'd been made feel guilty when you didn't necessarily need to feel that way?
Yeah. I mean, it was that. I mean, I was surrounded. I mean, because there's obviously very smart people in the program. So I just trusted. I trusted it 100%. There was really, for the longest time, no need to question, because, this is where the government sends you. This is what every rehab is doing. So there has to be something to it.
Right.
That's really what I told myself. It's so prevalent. It's so common. This has got to be it. There's got to be something up with me.
That's so true.
So yeah. And finding y'all's work was that moment, like, oh my goodness. And then that's when I'm like, okay, so we have, cancer, diabetes, and all these other ailments that we use empiricism and science to treat. But here we have addiction, where we have equine therapy, where you're grabbing a horse hoof or of course 12-step and believing you're an addict forever. And I mean, we talked about this the other day, about the difference between the language between quitting smoking and drug addiction. I mean, most people that quit smoking, people go through slips. They figure out what works for them, whether it's Chantix, cold turkey. People find their way. I mean, that's what they do. They figure out what's going to work for them. I mean, if you go on Facebook groups, you don't hear about powerlessness. You just, people find their way. They make some mistakes, and then they go about their business. They don't spend their lives talking about how they have a disease and all these other things. And really, the way I see it now is that, you could have somebody in the program for 10 years, and there's nothing about that person that has any relationship to alcoholism or addiction. That person's no longer struggling with the problem, but their belief in it becomes the problem. Their belief in it becomes the addiction or the alcoholism, because if they do decide to drink or they do decide to drug, and their entire identity is based on not doing this thing, what do you think is going to happen? They're not going to believe in their ability to cope with it.
Right.
It's just going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Let's talk about, let's bring it back to you. You said you started using drugs destructively, kind of like at first it was a really, really useful tool for coping. And yes. I think that it sounds like your downfall to that end is not that it wasn't a useful tool. It actually was. This wasn't illusory, but it was your only tool. Like other people you noticed could get through situations in which they felt stress or anxiety or whatever it was, and that they could seem to cope with it somehow. And you're thinking, why aren't you using this like magical cure, this like one-stop cure? And it sounds like you over relied on it. I mean, when I talk to you, I know I don't know you, but you sound like the kind of guy who has values that would say, don't steal. You're extremely polite. You're a nice guy. You're thoughtful. What do you think it was that allowed you to act antithetical to maybe the values that you would otherwise hold and do things like steal or get caught in that kind of a cycle?
I think the pain just become too hard to bear. I mean, whether it was the physical withdrawal or the psychological withdrawal, just the battlefield, which was the mind at the time, which I've since learned to cope with through mindfulness and meditation and other tools, was just, I mean, I just broke under the pressure of it, the pressure of guilt and shame and all these other things. I mean, and at the time, I didn't really have those standards that you're talking about. I lost those standards. I may have had them when I was younger, but I think I learned my way out of them and found justifications to not be the best person because, I'm perpetuating this life, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It's like you need to survive. You'll do what you need to do to survive.
Yes.
And so what led you out of, let me put it this way, if standard treatment, if 12 steps and things like that, and that entire hegemony of ideas didn't work out for you, what did?
Well, one of them that's integral was mindfulness and meditation. For the longest time, I was very identified and immersed in thought and emotion. I had no sense of stepping back from thinking, no sense of stepping back from emotion. I was just caught in the wave of it, if that makes any sense. So learning to find space and living from a place of awareness, like I know mindfulness is incorporated in LPP, but is the language that I'm speaking now, do you understand what I'm kind of getting at?
I think so. Go on.
Yes. So the other thing, which I started to read some philosophy stuff, and I found Aristotle's ethics, virtue ethics. And it was about 6 or 7 years ago, I started really working like the longest job I ever had. And I made a list, I kid you not, a list of virtues that I needed to focus on, because a virtue is a habit. I mean, it's things that we repeatedly do and become part of our character. And that's what Aristotle believed. And I centrally believe it's a way of responding to the world. So I made this list, and whenever something would crop up like that I didn't feel I could cope with, it was like I would meditate on the virtue I needed at the time.
What's an example of one of those virtues that you would meditate on?
Like perseverance. That was a big one, because I was a big, can I curse on the podcast?
Oh yeah, please do it a bunch, because people are so polite on it because they think it's like so professional that you could do extra.
Right on. I think fuck it was a mantra for many years, again, buckling under the pressure of pain and emotional distress. So perseverance was a big one. If I'm at work and my boss judges me and says, "Oh, you're doing this wrong," this just set off a domino effect in my brain about who I am and, oh, I'm a loser. So that's when I really need to focus on, okay, I'm sticking through this. I'm not going to run. I'm just going to make it through here, and I'm going to change. And that's how change happens. You set through the discomfort, so to speak.
So you practice mindfulness, and also you made a list of virtues. It's like, it sounds like something in between a planned action and a value or something like that. And you were able to extrapolate from those virtues real life experiences. It's like, all right, one thing I'm lacking is that I need to persevere. And you're able to slow down enough through mindfulness that you could think through what that means. And then you could try it out in the real world. And then it came back to you in some reinforced way. Is that a fair analysis?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know how much LPP goes into the plasticity of the brain and all that, but changes in the brain are literally happening when we do these things, and we're always changing.
That's
the
right.
self is a process.
Yeah, we don't go into neuroplasticity. We touch on it, but we don't go into it only because once you get out of the way, that your brain just changes with every change that you make in your life, socially, physically, then there's kind of no need for the conversation anymore, barring literal brain damage or something like that. It's like, okay, now we can talk in total practical terms, but it's the same point. It's exactly the same point that you're making, which Mark Lewis will talk about it in spades because he's a neuroscientist, and, it's like it's a peeve of his that people talk about the brain all the time. And he's saying the brain's always it's what a meat-headed argument to make. He uses the taxi cab driver in London example about how those people's brains change because of the habitual drives that they make. So it's sort of meaningless in a way, very meaningful in the sense that you're deprogramming from that language when you talk about brain changes. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, I just think a lot of people have I know in the program, there's this kind of fixed view of who we are. We're kind of the same always, but that's just not true. We change, we evolve, we grow,
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, that's how I see things. It's that actually Stanton Peele's daughter, Anna Peele, She writes for GQ, Gentleman's Quarterly, and she just interviewed Billy Bush. Billy Bush, I don't know if you know or remember him, but
Yes,
he's the guy. It's hard not to remember him if you know him, at least from this. But he got, what do you call it, canceled or whatever you call it, after that whole grab him by the whatever, with Trump. And so she visited him, and he sort of was just like, went through this slump, kind of depressed, feeling like, I can't build anything for myself, but he did have family to rely on, people helping him out. He kind of went through this woe is me phase, and then he decided, I'm just going to live my best life. But all that to say, someone like Billy Bush, who everybody says, oh, what a horrible guy, at some level need to accept an apology from a human being who shows that they can develop, and people do. And from, better or worse kinds of things, people who I know who have been in jail for really long periods of time for violent crimes have returned and made very positive impact in the world after that, because they were able to develop. People continue to develop their whole lives, and it sounds like you're no exception to that.
Yeah, we shouldn't brand people.
Absolutely. Now, are you able to get into that about some of the legal troubles that you went through associated with drugs and things like that, and that it's given you difficulty now, or is that something you would rather not touch?
No, we can talk about it. I mean, most of what I did is theft related to support my addiction. I have a few felonies, yes, plural. And, it's not like I committed any armed robberies. I mean, these were very petty crimes, but the charge was not petty. Obviously, a felony is a pretty big deal. And that has been a huge hindrance. That's society branding me with something based on who I used to be. And it's going to follow me forever. And it's been a great difficulty dealing with a felony because, a lot of places offer background checks, and I've been in a lot of interviews, most interviews where people say, well, I would love to hire you. It would be great if I could hire you. I think you would be a great fit, but because corporate says this, I cannot. So what was it, a few years ago? I think it was a couple years ago. I almost got on at the health department in the IT department.
Wow.
Yeah, I was so excited. And all three of the administrators were fighting for me to work there. But it came down from Tallahassee that I could not work there. So
you're a skilled guy, obviously intelligent. This is my second time speaking with you, and you're able to cut through, like act on first principles and cut through bullshit like anyone I've ever talked to with a PhD. I mean, it sounds like you have skills and things to offer, but you're bogged down by a lasting felony charge on your record. Did you go through any sort of like restorative process, like returning money that was owed, or maybe you didn't get a chance to?
No, all of it was returned. That's all done. And I asked an attorney about expungement, and, when I was 20, I had a public defender. That was the first felony. And I wasn't told that when you plead guilty in the state of Florida, that you can't have it expunged. Like, you basically sacrifice any ability to do that, to have it sealed. And then I went into drug court. And I think one of the things with drug court is you have to plead guilty. And in some cases they do withhold adjudication or something, but I think pleading guilty is like part of the package. Wow. So, yeah.
So how did you, with that weight on your shoulder, what are the kinds of life channels that you were able to find and pursue that keep you moving forward and non-addicted?
Well, I mean, right now, I have a job that I do care about. I mean, it's not a prestigious job. I'm a truck driver, but I go to work every day and I try to do the best I can. Even if it's not prestigious, it does give me a sense of purpose. And I'm a parent. My son is immensely important to me. And partly the reason why I'm on the phone right now, it's like, what would I want him to do if he was petrified to do something? I'd want him to face it. So I don't want to be one of those do as I say, not as I do people. I want to walk through it. So, and I just crave learning now. Like, I feel like my head was in the sand for years. And I think starting out with drugs, there was like a curiosity about something deeper about life. And now I can seek, I can seek in a more positive way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And do you do any of the standard treatment-y kinds of things? Or are you like, was there total outgrowth from that?
Total outgrowth from that. I don't really even look at anything that I do as like treatment or recovery. I just kind of live my life. And, it's just like with smoking. I quit smoking a year ago. I very rarely think about, my addiction, or, unless I need to talk about it. I'm in Facebook groups with people that are in recovery, and I try to share input when I can in those groups to be helpful. And that's one thing, like, I really want to be helpful in this arena some way, like, which is why I initially called you. Is I feel like the language that we're using around addiction and all that is being more harmful than helpful. So that's given me purpose, and hopefully I can find avenues to help.
Imagine, man, I feel like the world needs you, because here you are, a guy who, you're talking about how your head's kind of submerged in the sand so often, especially when it came down to these government agencies and a medical theocracy telling you that there's something damaged about you. And maybe you felt like that wasn't true, but you couldn't really push back on that. Like, you had to be wrong somehow if all the people were telling you to do it. And you're able somehow still to carve out a niche for yourself in just total practical common sense of a way. You're just living your best life. You did things like meditation, writing down virtues and practicing them, trying things that are difficult, even though they scare you or make you nervous, have work that you could decide not to find meaningful, but you find meaning in every moment of it. You have a child that you're raising. I feel like you are the kind of person who there need to be a million of. Every time I talk to someone like you, which there aren't that many. There are people who are in your situation and maybe afraid to speak up, but there aren't that many people willing to speak up, use their own name, talk out loud, and then spend their time helping other people in similar situations. It makes me really, really hopeful about the kind of message that I would like to get across. Do you have any plans or ideas about how to become immersed in that kind of work?
Not exactly. I think about finishing school. I have 50 credits at the community college, but due to some life circumstances, I had to kind of put that on the back burner. But, I thought about maybe getting a counseling degree, but my concern is if I get a counseling degree and am I going to be shoved in, some kind of 12-step orthodoxy and not be able to kind of be open about it, kind of find what works for each person kind of thing. So I'm really not sure. I just started a Facebook group. Maybe that'll be helpful.
What's the group?
It is called Rethink Addiction Info and Support is the name of it.
All right, people is it free? Like, can people just join it, or is it a private group, or?
It's a public group, but you do have to request to come in, and then I just approve it.
Got it. And yeah, I'm thinking of like a trillion things you could do. Not that I should impose on you what to do, but besides this podcast, I host another podcast, and enough people became interested in it. I did it for free for a couple of years, but enough people became interested in it that I made like Patreon membership kind of a thing, and like paid to podcast now. And then I write articles, and I'm paid to write articles for places. And I see that if you want to do something like that, I know that you'll get in there somewhere, and happy to help out where I can and continue that conversation. And also I would encourage people, if they're listening and can think of an ideal opportunity for Jason, either in your organization or otherwise, or if they need help, maybe reach out. Is there a way for people to contact you?
Yeah, through the group. I don't have a Twitter anymore. I kind of had to unplug from the Twitterverse.
Good on you.
It can be a little chaotic. So,
seriously.
I think that's probably the best way is through the group or through Facebook.
Well, Jason, just one more time, thank you so much for being willing and kind of brave enough to share your story, and for being the first non-life process program person to share a recovery story that doesn't involve 12 steps as a way forward and doesn't involve being bogged down by a brain disease as a way forward, but just finding meaning and purpose in life. And I commend you for it. And thank you again.
Thank you, Zach, very much. And thanks for what you're doing.